Welcome to our invitation-only event for the life members and the leadership circle of the Historical Society of Cheshire County. I'm sure you all realize that any gift of any size to our organization is important, but our life members and leadership circle make an enormous impact on what we do and what we can do. With your help, we're able to serve as a hub for people who connect through history, art, culture, and the environment. We work with all of them. We're grateful for your support, and we are indeed fortunate today that Dayton Duncan and Ken Burns agreed to be our special guests. Ken and Dayton have made history accessible for millions of people, and in the process, they've become part of Cheshire County history themselves. In today's program, I will ask our guests a few questions about their work together, and if time permits, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers afterwards. And then I invite you to drop by the Historical Society next door for refreshments at our featured exhibit entitled Mountain as Muse, where you can see how Mount Monadnock has inspired artists over the years. And your support helped make that exhibit possible. Really no introduction is necessary for these two, but I'll say a few words about our guests. Ken has been making documentary films for almost 50 years, and that's even longer than I've been executive director of the Historical Society. Since the Academy Award-nominated Brooklyn Bridge in 1981, he's gone on to direct and produce some of the most acclaimed historical documentaries ever made. You're familiar with many of them, including the Civil War, baseball, jazz, the war, country music, the Vietnam War, the American Buffalo, and many others. Dayton Duncan moved to Cheshire County in 1971, and I think that's about the time I met him. He worked at the Keene Sentinel for several years and has gone on to be the author of 14 books. For more than 30 years, he's collaborated with Ken as a writer and producer of some of those historical documentaries. From Lewis and Clark, The Journey of the Corps of Discovery, to the American Buffalo, which was broadcast by PBS last October. So what I'm going to do is ask them some questions, and they're going to tell you about their time together and their work based on these questions. So we'll walk through some highlights and memories of your collaboration over the years, and we'll move on to quickly cover the films that you've done together. So let's get started. First of all, Ken, how did the two of you meet?
First of all, thank you, and thank all of you. The historical societies and our libraries and our archives are the front line of keeping our history, and if you don't have a history, you don't have a present, and you certainly don't have a future. So we really salute your support for this amazing organization. Thank you. So in the late 70s, I was freelancing to stay alive and pay the bills, and we would get day jobs from people like the BBC or Italian television to come up. So we promised we'd go anywhere in New England without a per diem charge, meaning no mileage or no hotel bills or whatever. So we'd had to get up and drive and do it. So we had a job to interview the current governor of the state of New Hampshire about some of the reuses of the old Amoskeag mills along the river there in Manchester. And so we met in the town next door on the town green. The whole thing was set up by his chief of staff, Dayton Duncan. So I ended up having some conversations with him in advance. We met at the town green. I'm sure Dayton has much better observations. Later on, I was getting married and had forgotten everything but the license. I mean, it remembered everything but the license. And so a desperate last minute call to the chief of staff of the governor of New Hampshire and ensured that happy union. We just kept bumping into each other, and sometimes at political rallies we'd be standing in the back and we'd end up talking. And then Dayton lived at that point in Roxbury, and we kind of merged our families. And I already had a couple gals, and then Dayton had a gal and then moved out to Kansas and then came back living just a few doors down from our editing house in Walpole. And we had been already decided to collaborate on a history of Lewis and Clark based on the book that Dayton had written, subtracting Dayton's personal experiences in favor of just telling the story of the Corps of Discovery. But it also, we ended up having first to deal with a film about the West, and we've just gone on to do the things that Alan listed together. But Dayton probably has another view of it or not. Maybe we should be in the lightning round and we'll just keep going. That's how we met, and we've been friends ever since. And even his retirement hasn't dented the friendship. Even his moving away to Ringe, which is, if you're in the upper left-hand corner of Cheshire County and you move to Ringe, you're sort of saying something. I asked him, I said, is it my breath? And no. And he also spends half his time in Savannah, Georgia, which is even a little bit farther than Ringe. And so, but still, we collaborated together. Dayton produced and wrote, and then for the last two on Franklin and the American Buffalo, he just wrote and let others do that. But the collaborations have been among the most satisfying associations, and the products of those collaborations are the films that I'm proudest of.
Would you like to add anything to that, Dayton, and tell us how that meeting ended up in you collaborating
And
together?
now the real story. Well, I'll just say quickly is that when Ken walked into the governor's office for this interview that he and I had arranged on the phone, I'd never met him and didn't know anything about him. He walked in and I thought he was the intern. I said, well, when's the filmmaker showing up here? But anyway, he told me about that he's moved to Walpole, New Hampshire, a town I used to cover for the Keene Sentinel, and told me, I said, well, what are you, that he's there living in New Hampshire because it was cheaper and he's working on a film. I said, well, what's the film? He said, it's about the building of a bridge. And as an ex-reporter, I thought to myself, well, that's about the boringest topic you could probably ever come up with. And I said, well, and I said, and it's probably the Brooklyn Bridge. You're trying to sell the Brooklyn Bridge, right? And as a joke, he says, well, that's right. That's what it's about. And I thought, okay, so you're living in New Hampshire, trying to write, working on a film about the building of a bridge, which happens to be the Brooklyn Bridge, and you're living in New Hampshire instead of New York. And he explained all the things. But I sort of thought, well, all that's interesting and going probably nowhere. And then he read in the newspaper that the governor and I were going to Hollywood for the Academy Awards because On Golden Pond had been filmed in New Hampshire with a new film bureau that our administration had started. And so we were going out for the governor to go meet all the studio heads to say, look, come to New Hampshire and make your films and you can get an Academy Award too. And I got a call and this voice said, hi, it's Ken Burns. I thought, it's the kid, He said, I don't know if you remember. I thought, yeah, sure I remember. The bridge, right? Then he goes, well, I saw that you're going to Hollywood with the governor, and that film I told you about has been nominated for an Academy Award. And I'd love to have the governor of my state come to a screening in Hollywood. Is that at all possible? I said, sure. And we worked it out. And I got to see the film, and any doubts I ever had about his, judgment and sense of what a good story can be, vanished right then. Anyway, so as Ken said, we became friends. As many of you know, I was involved in a number of losing presidential campaigns, which gave me a lot of time to work on books. And one of them took me to Kansas to work on my third book, Miles from Nowhere. But our family is very close. He and his wife and daughters came out to visit us, and we could come back to Walpole and visit with them. But I was driving a lot around the West, and I started making this list of stories that I thought my friend ought to, consider making. And so a number of them, basically it's a list that we then ended up doing. The first one was the West, and when he started doing that, he said, well, if I'm going to do this film, I want you involved, because you've spent seemed like half your life now driving around the West, and you know the places, you know the history, and I want you involved. And so I backed in as the co-writer and consulting producer of that, and the rest is history, and pun intended. But it was, my working with him was not the result of a nationwide search. It was happenstance, but been a great ride.
What memories stand out about the making of Lewis and Clark, which came out in 1997? Ken?
So this is, what we spent a lot of time together out in the West, usually in a GMC or a Chevy Suburban, traveling big distances in places where the towns are not 6 or 7 miles apart as they are here, but they might be 70. For example, Big Sandy to Winifred is in north central Montana is that, and crosses over the Missouri River. And what we had developed over the years, and it stands out more than anything else, it's really wonderful, is that we'd be alone. For a while, we had a little thing with Twizzlers, and we had a little thing with beef jerky. Well, we've still got that. And then what was that grapefruit soda stuff that we should do? Fresca. And when you stop, but the biggest thing is that you look, and there would be Winifred, and it would be like 15 miles away, and the Missouri breaks, and you can sort of see the road disappear. And Dayton would turn to me, or I would turn to Dayton. We just traded choruses, if you will. And they'd say, look, I'm sure there's a great cafe in town. What do you want for lunch or dinner, depending on what it was. And then the other person would describe this elaborate multi-course meal that you could get only in Paris or at the finest restaurant in New York City. Oh, I would start off with an endive salad with a lovely lemon vinaigrette, and then a Chateaubriand, and this, and then end with a creme brulee, whatever. And then there would be this pause, and whoever had asked the question would say, "What do you want on your cheeseburger?" And so we would go in. The cafe would be open. We would each have a cheeseburger, and then we would repeat it the next day or that evening as we were approaching another town, and we got a chance to describe it. But we really learned the stuff. We love this state, and it's really, I would live no other place. It's just the best. And what's so great is it's so relatively gigantic. Part of the you can't get there from here is northern New England. And so to go up, say, to Berlin is like a big job, right? I can get to New York almost as fast, and certainly without the same effort it would take to get to Berlin. And I love it. But there's something also about what the West tells about our imagination, the mythology of us, the things that we think we are and the things we actually are. Being here roots us in the things we actually are. And so I've learned so much from Dayton. The stories, he's a dog with a bone, and he investigates stuff and he looks into it. So Horatio's Drive, he was talking about for 10 years. You'd think Americans would know exactly who drove across the country first with this love of automobiles, the love of being first. Nobody knows the story except Dayton. And he and Diane, in the course of their research, discovered the central archive that permitted us to tell the story, letters he sent back to his wife in Vermont. We talked about the buffalo for more than 30 years and discussed it seriously, and I'm so glad we waited, and it was the last film that we've done together, besides he'll consult and stuff for various things that we do. It's been wonderful.
That was a subject, Lewis and Clark, that you knew well. Do you have any additional memories of that project?
Well, you want to do a day by day?
No.
We can do it.
No, I mean, that was a great film to work on because it's part of my bloodstream. I've written 3 books now about the expedition. going back to those places with my good friend and being able to introduce him to South Dakota and to see a buffalo herd, come over their eyes, and his eyes would get this big at those things, or just how gigantic. I introduced him to Montana and North Dakota, how big his eyes would get, and that was helpful to me in Idaho. Yeah. I was his welcome to the state person on those, but his eyes got so big, and I realized that for us in the film that we were working on together, I had to. It really awakened me to what I knew, but I really hadn't felt in the writing, was these were all guys on the expedition from wooded lands in the east, a couple of them from New Hampshire, one of them from Charlestown, Willard. And they were experiencing this without any preparation. They'd not seen John Ford movies and other things. This is all new to them, and his wide eyes really helped me try to emphasize how new that was for these explorers. And one of my great memories is actually after the film came out, we had the great honor to have a special showing of excerpts from it in the Clinton White House, in the East Room of the White House, which had been where Meriwether Lewis lived when he was the executive assistant to Thomas Jefferson. So in the place where Jefferson and Lewis would have talked about the planning of the expedition was where we got to show the current president what that was. And our now late friend Steve Ambrose was there at this too. And we used the reception, the three of us, to gang up separately on Clinton about saving the White Cliffs of the Missouri, which is the most unchanged portion of the whole route, to save that. And at the very last, and then 3 or 4 years later, at the very last official event in the White House was the event where Clinton signed the document using the Antiquities Act to create the White Cliffs National Monument. And I have the honor of owning that pen now. And he made Clark posthumously a legitimate captain. He made Sacagawea and York official members of the expedition. He also made a national monument out of the one place in Montana, Pompey's Pillar, where William Clark had signed his name and date, the only remaining evidence of their time through that. So it was very special.
Changing gears a little, then came a biography of Mark Twain. Tell us a little about that. Making that, Ken.
So, we've done a lot of biographies, and biographies are the constituent building blocks of almost all of the bigger series that we've done. There's other parts that are not specifically biography, but I think the skeletal system, the thing that unites those big series, are talking about people. Twain is one of the most important. He's arguably the greatest writer in American history. He's the funniest guy in the 19th century. He's the one who said, "It's not that the world is filled with fools, it's just that lightning isn't distributed right," which I defy you to find any other 19th century humorist and have any line that's funny. And that will be funny for as long as we have not destroyed our planet. And everybody understands exactly what he means. Another thing he said, which we used to open our Prohibition film, is he said, "Nothing so needs reforming as other people's habits." And this is the story of the United States right now. We loved him. This was co-written, which is an unusual thing that we had between Dayton and the other writer that I've worked with, Jeffrey Ward. And this is an amazing paradoxical film. He's the funniest guy on earth, and he has more tragedy than the Kennedy family. He's got he's in a fishbowl. Everything that happens, the entire world knows about. He has written, as a later biography of ours on Ernest Hemingway said, that all of American history begins with Mark Twain, meaning begins with Huck Finn, meaning begins with the moment in the novel where he has been taught all his life that he will go to hell if he aids in any way the escape of a slave, and he begins to be worried about the fact that he's been with Jim, and he writes out a letter to the people who are pursuing Jim on the Mississippi River, telling them where their wanted property is. And then he stops and he starts to think about how kind Jim has been, how much Jim loves his own, the way we love Aaron. And it's written. Tom Sawyer is written by Mark Twain, but Huck Finn is written by Huck Finn. It's in the dialect of somebody who the scholar Jocelyn Chadwick is unlearning all the bad stuff that Americans still need to unlearn, and he just thinks about all the times that he's been on his watch, how happy he is to see him, and calls me honey and such like things. And he said, I knowed I had to decide betwixt two things. And he looks at Jim and he looks at the letter and he tears up the letter and he says, I guess I'll go to hell. And it's, still can't really talk about it without wanting to cry. That's the beginning of America. Everything else is pretending to be English literature. This man who wrote with the bark on, who wrote the way we sounded, who heard the way we sounded, who was an enormous noticer, as his biographer Ron Powers said, could look at you, sir, and know what was in your pockets and what you did from a living and how your hands were calloused or not calloused. And he was just an amazing observer, and he understood writing a novel that takes place in slavery at the moment that Reconstruction, which comes down to us because the losers wrote the history as a bad thing, was actually a good thing. Its collapse was the tragedy that sparked his ability to go and finish this most remarkable of novels. And we had the great good fortune to interview now the late novelist Russell Banks up in Keene, New York, where in the foothills of the Adirondacks, and great novelist. And he said that Twain had written with Huck Finn our Iliad and our Odyssey, that while most of us, I see from this room, nearly all of us share the European heritage with the authors of the Iliad and the Odyssey, America was experiencing two things that were not true to the Europeans of that time, which was race and space, the physical space, the sheer size and magnitude of the geography. And that while some writers might tentatively treat race, and very few had really dealt with space, Herman Melville did in Moby Dick, but it was ocean space, which has its own forbidding terrors. Mark Twain literally took them both on, and he was our Iliad. He wrote our Iliad and our Odyssey, and I'll never forget that interview and how much he just passed away last year. So anyway, Mark Twain. So we'll get to the Buffalo at about 1:30 tonight.
You mentioned Horatio's Drive, America's first road trip already, which was the first automobile trip across the country. What drew you to that story, Dayton?
Well, during this time when I was working on my book, Miles from Nowhere, I was reading a book about the Lincoln Highway, which obviously was not there when Horatio Nelson Jackson, on a $50 bet, decided to try to be the first person to drive a car across the continent. But I came across this little one paragraph that said, well, the first person to ever drive a car across the continent was Horatio Nelson Jackson. He was a doctor from Vermont, kind of eccentric. He did it on a $50 bet that a car could actually, do that. He adopted a dog named Bud along the way, wore goggles. And it just stopped me. And I thought, God, that's a great story. And so for 10 years, as Ken already said, whenever we're working on other films, I said, we ought to do a film about Horatio Nelson Jackson. They go, yeah, sure, yeah, okay. I said, no, really. And then anyway, I kept at it and started doing research sideways, on the side of the other films we were working on. And when we were working on Mark Twain, I realized I really couldn't. I'd found that he had photographs up in Burlington at the University of Vermont Library. The Smithsonian had the car itself and Bud's goggles. and some newspaper clippings. And so I was piecing it, all together, but I had to sort of give it up. And Diane, my beloved wife, who's an ex-reporter like me, took on the task of trying to find more, because I said, this guy knew he was making history. He must have kept a journal, but I can't find any notion of that. And then I came across an article that said as he's being interviewed in New York when it was all over, he'd invite his wife, who he called Swipes for reasons lost to history, into the room, and she would pull out the letters that he wrote. And I said, And so there are letters somewhere. And Diane, this is before the invention of the internet and all those kind of things, took on the task that I was starting with, just painstaking, of calling all the people. We found the obituary of Jackson's wife, and got the name of their daughter, and then her obituary, and saw the names of two people that no longer had the name Jackson. And she started cold calling people around, and finally, through that dogged reporting, found the two granddaughters who had the letters and let us do it. And when I told Ken that, then it got put on the list.
Can I just add one thing to that? Is that I was working on a big history of the Second World War, appropriate to yesterday, the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and today, which is D-Day +1, that I had been in Hollywood and I was trolling for voices, and I saw across the room Tom Hanks. And I was with my daughters, and they said, "Dad, just go up and talk to him." I said, "He's talking to other people. I don't want to interrupt him." And I was getting really terrified to ask. And finally, I sort of tentatively moved away. He looked up, saw me, broke away from his conversation, and he walked up to me. He said, "I owe you big time." And I went, "Excuse me?" And he goes, "I owe you big time. When we were making From the Earth to the Moon, in order to study dramatic structure, we studied not only your Civil War, but we studied your baseball as well, to do how you keep multiple stories going on at once." I'm thinking, wow, feature film in Hollywood was going to a documentary maker. And he said, "What can I do?" I said, "Well, I'm making a film on World War II, which I know is your passion." And Band of Brothers was sort of hitting things then, or is already out or whatever. He said, "I'll do anything you want." And I said, "Well, we're also doing this film, which is sort of funny, about the guy's first cross-country automobile trip. And we don't have the guy, we've just discovered his letters, and we don't have a guy who is reading." He said, "I'll do it." So actually he became a huge part of the war. And in fact, read a part of a newspaper editor in Laverne, Minnesota, a tiny town in Lake County that's in the far left-hand corner of Minnesota. And he so loved reading it that he only types out letters. He typed out a letter to me on a manual typewriter that said, "Dreaming of Al McIntosh, hope there's more." Nobody who's ever read for us has ever said that. So one of my co-producers, co-directors, went back out to the morgue in Laverne, Minnesota, and found more. And after a prologue, the first voice you hear in this 15-hour film is Tom Hanks reading Al McIntosh. And the very last thing, which brings me to tears every time, is the returning veterans in January of '45, home having a snowball fight in downtown Laverne. And we've got color footage of the snowball fight. And they've just been in the greatest fight in the history of the world. And you just can't, if you're not alive, if you don't have a heart in your breast, if you don't weep at the irony of coming out of the greatest cataclysm and having a snowball fight in downtown Laverne, Minnesota, between the cars in that early kind of weird color. And Tom read that. But the first thing he read was Horatio Nelson Jackson, and he got it right. It was funny, and you would go, "Oh, that's Tom Hanks," and then the next second you'd forget about it. And he was Horatio Nelson Jackson.
In 2009, you did The National Parks, America's Best Idea. What do both of you have as remembrances of that collaboration?
Well, mine is so personally transformative that it's hard for me to talk about it. But I joined Dayton and our crew a couple days late in Yosemite. I'd driven out from California and gotten there and hit that place where you can see the valley and gone, it's got to be a backdrop. And I went in there and I had been explaining as we had worked on the project that I had never been, this is going to be the first national park I'd ever been to. And we went up past the Nevada Inverno Falls, and we spent a night in tents with the park ranger, and we got some shots, and we went all around. And the first thing I did was I took over the tripod and did this long tilt down the 2 sections of Yosemite Falls that's in the opening of the film. And it was sort of great because I had already sort of positioned myself out of cinematography and into just directing and producing and some writing. And the last night we were all going to leave, and in the middle of the night I woke up and something was wrong, and I suddenly realized that this was not the first national park that I'd been in. And in fact, when my mother was dying of cancer, I was 6 or 7 years old in 1959. My dad took me out of school early on a Friday night, and we drove to Baltimore, Maryland, where he'd grown up, and I slept in his bed. And we'd gotten up before dawn and drove. I've never done that in my life. We drove to Front Royal, and we went up and went along the Skyline Drive and stopped off in Luray and found some cabins and spent the night there. And we took this impossibly long hike of maybe a half a mile, and I saw a gigantic waterfall, which you would call a cataract of maybe 4 or 5 feet. We turned over some logs and found these bright orange salamanders, and I will never forget, but apparently I did. It wasn't a memory that I'd repressed. It had just been smothered by all the tsunami of tragedy that would overtake our, terribly frightened family. And in fact, 5 or 6 years later, my mom did die, and sort of prompted a lot of what I do for a living. But I suddenly realized that when everyone asks me, what's my favorite national park? I always say it's 2. It's Yosemite, for the gift of being arguably the greatest and most beautiful place on earth, but it's also for waking me up to the fact that I had been to this relatively minor but still wonderful park called Shenandoah.
My job for about 6 years working on National Park as the writer and the lead producer was to go to all the national parks. Pretty good gig, huh? And get paid as well. I still think of the whole 30 years that somebody from the human resources up there was going to tap me on the shoulder with a clipboard and say, "Are you Dayton Duncan?" I said, "Yeah." And I'd say, "Yeah." And they said, "Well, this is not what we had you down for doing." So I had the greatest job ever I could ever had. It wasn't a job for me. And it was awful nice to be paid for it as well. But so the park, as we were working on the parks, we also involved our families quite a bit. And I would, as the producer, I could, in charge of the timing of certain trips, and they happened to coincide a lot of times with school vacations. And so we would take our kids to some of them as well. Particularly one that sticks out in my mind. They all stick out in my mind. Watching the film is like watching home movies for us. We remember that moment when that shot was taken and all the 20 hours of searching for the right place and waiting for the sun to come up and all those in there. So it's very personal for both of us. We floated the Grand Canyon and we're shooting that, and so we arranged that Ken brought his oldest child, no longer a child, Sarah. With him, I brought Will, our son, who was, I forget how old by that point he was. He'd been on other trips with us to Alaska and other places as well. And Buddy Squires, our cinematographer, I told him, I said, "Buddy, I'll give you a chance. We got room in, you can bring an assistant cameraman to help you, load film and do all those things, or bring Kirsten, who he was engaged to at the time. It just means double your work, because she's not going to change the camera rolls for it, but if she wants to come along with that." So she came, and it was just a great as it gets. Oh, and then at the end of it, we were showing clips of the film to the National Park Service in the headquarters of the Interior Department.
Yes, this is the most important story you'll hear today.
in Washington, D.C. And at the end of it, the director of the National Park Service asked Ken and me both to come up there and made us honorary park rangers, which is only about 50 people have ever been named that. Most of them are dead presidents. But in addition to that, we got the hats. And so my family learned when I got crabby around the house, they would say to Diane, "Mom, go get the ranger hat for Dad." Because rangers aren't allowed to be crabby. So, but it was one of the great honors that,
We know exactly where our hats are exactly at this moment.
Yeah, right.
No, it's
Well,
true.
you're lucky we didn't wear them here tonight.
If we knew you'd ask that question, you might have.
In 2012, you came out with the Dust Bowl, which is about the greatest man-made environmental catastrophe in American history. So how could you bring that story to life, Dayton?
Well, you could do, we've done films about Lewis and Clark. We didn't get to interview either of them. And a lot of things with characters and events long past. And the Dust Bowl, by this point that we were working on it, was 70 years in the past. And I knew we could make a really good film on it, but I remembered when I did my book, Miles from Nowhere, interviewing people who'd lived through it. Part of my book was going through the part that was hit by the Dust Bowl and hearing these stories, incredible stories in person from people about when they were kids. And so we did a crash thing of just trying to go out and find people who were still alive and who had lived through it. We had letters from things. There was a great writer who'd gone to Smith or Holyoke, Mount Holyoke, I think, who had moved out as a woman homesteader, and she wrote these wonderful descriptions of it. And we had all the makings of a regular great documentary in our style, but I really thought it might help to get people who'd lived through it to do it. And so we went out and put up to historical societies and others in that area, nursing homes and others. If Ken Burns wants you, we ran ads in local weekly newspapers, and come meet some producers. Just bring us your stories and your photographs if you got them, and got to interview 35 people. And the youngest was probably 85. But in interviewing them, it was this weird thing. It was as if it was yesterday to them still, but it was still a childhood memory. But now they're old enough that they could sort of relate to the trauma for their parents, that it was for the adults, and the family poverty and the ruination of the crops and all those things. And we'd let the children who were as old as we were sit in on the interviews, and they heard stories that their parents had never told them. But that really made that film.
I think that's exactly right. We realized after a while, though the people were 85 to 100, we were talking to children. And that most memorable for me were two brothers who we sat together, and they had lost a baby sister to the dust pneumonia. That all of you still remember when your parents were stressed out. And you can imagine that the Dust Bowl, these dust storms were not one a year, but maybe 30 a year, and it went on for 10 years. I mean, this is a man-made ecological disaster second only to climate change. And it's unbelievable. And these old men in their late 80s, if not early 90s, were remembering the death of a sister at like a year and a half, 2 years old. And it was happening now in the next. And they remembered exactly what they said to her and how one had been a little bit impatient about. and they both cried. It was so immediate that we realized that, we think about looking at D-Day yesterday and the fact that maybe even next year, most of those men will not be able to make the trip. And certainly in 5 years, there won't be anybody left. And the extent to which having these oral histories, it's our obligation to go out and collect these records. So at least though we have some kind of, there's an intermediary, an unfortunate intermediary, it's better than having these stories lost forever. Oh yeah, and then Christopher Nolan, of Oppenheimer fame, really interesting director, made a sci-fi film that's like almost as long as our films. It's like 2 hours and 45 minutes, something like that. But what he wanted these, clearly what had happened to the Earth, as you learn in backstories along, is there had been some huge ecological calamity. One could assume climate change or whatever, but he interspersed the film with monitors that had many of our talking heads from the film on it. You couldn't hear them, you didn't cut to them. They were just part of the background story that you realize there were people who had lived before this calamity had overtaken Earth, and he added it to that film.
In 2019, you did a history of country music. Dayton and then Ken, can you tell us how making that was different than your other films?
Actually, I should start. Yeah, let me start, and then we'll do this. So we're Stalinists behind the back. We work in 5 and 10 year plans, and so we have to plan lots of films out and to assemble the funding, or at least most of the funding. So we had this 10-year plan that began in 2009. Sort of the I can't remember whether the Parks was the last or of the old one or the first of the new one. But anyway, we had some obligations. One of them was a big, what they call tentpole series. And Dayton and I were talking about a lot of ideas. We settled on one and we were working on it. We were trouble having purchase and figuring out exactly how we were going to do this well. And it was, not dissimilar to other things that we were getting started on in other ways. And I was out in Texas trying to raise money. I was staying at a friend's house who'd been helpful, and I came down in the morning. He said, Ken, his name is Cappy McGar. He says, Ken, what you should do is country music. And I looked at him and I went, for once, he is absolutely right. And so I went back to Dayton. I said, look, we still want to keep this project. I don't want to put it on some back burner. I'm not tabling it, but I thought, Cappy had suggested this, but I thought that maybe the big series that we ought to think about doing is one on country music. We never spoke about the other project until this moment again. And I don't know what happened to it. It's gone. It was gone. And we were literally that second engaged in a multi-year, many-year, joyous story that for us was just about as good as it gets as a production, and so complicated and so unexpected and so deeply moving. And sorry.
No. The one thing that's different about that one than most of the other films that we've done, learning from the Dust Bowl, I was paying more attention to the age of the people that I was hoping to interview. And particularly artists. And so I, looked at the actuarial tables, and even though I didn't feel I was quite ready for us to start interviewing them because I hadn't done as much research as I normally would want, we reached out to a number of people. 2 of them agreed and then died before we had the chance to interview them. George Jones. No, not George Jones. I'm sorry. It was Ray Price and George Jones. We interviewed little Jimmy Dickens because the manager of the Grand Ole Opry said, "Don't let another winter go by before he's not going to die, but he's weakened after each winter." And so we drew up this list and we started interviewing them. I also had a list of, 10 academic writers and historians that, would be our normal type of people go. But as we went along interviewing artists and songwriters and others, we realized they know the story as well and as accurate generally as the book writers. And so we just kept putting them off. And we interviewed 100 people for that, that series, 180 hours of interviews for a 16-hour film, which is about our average, percentage. But one historian was all we ended up doing. And the thing that is so great about that was they, for some reason, because it's a series about an art form. That's how we approach it. This is a legitimate, uniquely American art form, and let's tell its historical story. But the people who are in that brought to it in the interviews things that weren't, dry analysis. They felt it and they communicated it in ways, and we'd invite them if they wished to bring their instruments with it. And so, Vince Gill plays the start of a song that he wrote, Go Rest High on That Mountain, started when his brother died, and then he couldn't finish it. And then several years later, his close friend Keith Whitley, another great star of his own age, died. And so he finished that film. And then he sang that film at George Jones's memorial service. And so, it was just transformative in that. We asked Loretta Lynn, about some of her songs, and we'd lean forward and say, well, give me a little bit of that. And so she'd sing a little bit of Don't Come Home a Drinking with Lovin' on Your Mind. And
a feminist track.
Right. And so it gave this, it was a very serious historical look at an art form, but having those people on camera made that film the way that the survivors made the film for the Dust Bowl, I think.
I got to do a number of the interviews, and the only thing I'll say is just 2 words about it: Dolly Parton. No, we had just, she's spectacular. I mean, there's my friend Wynton Marsalis from our jazz series. We've stayed very, very close, like brothers. And he said she's never sung a wrong note in her life. And she's an amazing force, but also Vince and Marty Stewart has been the keeper of what you understood is that you were joining a family that was really happy to have you there. Like, we'll set another place at Thanksgiving. And we want to bring you in and we want to tell you about it. It's the only musical form in which you could have a hit 35 years ago and you're still in the family 35 years later. It's not you're washed up, you're not a one-hit wonder, you're not kicked out. And so it has a sort of, it really cares about its history for the most part. And yet it's also been firmly rooted in commerce, all for the whole part. And it's just got moments where this elemental, pure American poetry just comes through, whether it's Hank Williams or it's Johnny Cash or Merle Haggard. That Dayton did an interview with Merle before he died, and I referred to him in the editing room as Zeus, like if there was any point we needed to have Zeus. And Emmylou Harris, who we also interviewed and have become friends with, said that if you wanted to know about country music, you just take a Merle Haggard album, it didn't matter which one, and you put it, to give her age, you put it, whatever the needle on whatever cut, didn't matter what it was, and that was your introduction to it. And we kind of thought, well, that's nice hyperbole, and we found out in every way, shape, and form how true that was, and so getting to know the people and how complicated the music is underneath it and the stories was just about as good as it gets, right? And the last episode has been really important. One of the reasons why you live in Walpole, New Hampshire, is that you don't want to, as they say in country music, get above your raisin. You know, they said, they have a thing, don't get above your raisin. Like, don't think you're too much. So whatever Emmys that people list that we have or whatever, plus 50 cents, get you a cup of coffee in this area. And we like that a lot.
That leads right into my next question, one of our last questions. You both, this is your adopted home here in this region. Why does this place hold you? What's special about it for you?
Well, I was asked that question by New Hampshire Public Television in 1982 after the Brooklyn Bridge had been nominated for Academy Award. And so they wanted to find out who the hell was living in Walpole, New Hampshire that got nominated for an Academy Award on his first film. And they said, and so why are you here? And I said, look out the window, first of all. I did move here, as Dayton said, just because I knew I needed to get a real job in New York after I finished shooting most of the film. And if I did that, I'd put the footage up on a refrigerator, and like that, I'd be 40 years old and not have done it, like the ad guy who complains about the novel that he never wrote. And I moved here and figured how to do it. And then when it was nominated, people said, come back to New York or you're going to LA. I said, no, I made the best professional decision I ever made in my life. And that was, I'm going to stay here. The second best decision was to move up here. But to stay here was it. And I don't need to tell anybody in this room why we're here and why it matters. And it's just so beautiful, and people are so amazing, and nobody cares about how many Emmys you have. And it's great. It's just, I love this place. I've lived in my same bedroom for 45 years next month. Don't see any reason to change.
Well, I moved up, as I think I said, in 71. Part of, at the same time that there's sort of the little back the land movement and stuff like that. And so, I tried to, for a while, to cut my own wood and heat my house with several stoves and make maple syrup and all those kind of things. I'm a native Iowan, but I moved up here and the roots started to grow, and they just kept growing. It's a really special area of it, Cheshire County. It's got its own vibrancy. I love the mix of entrepreneurs and artists across the writers. Some of my best friends, like Ernie Hebert, born and raised here, taught me how to write a newspaper story. There's, I don't know what it is in the water or what, but Mount Monadnock, I can now see the top tip of Monadnock finally in the house that we live in Rindge.
Which is really far from Walpole.
Right. But I couldn't see it from Walpole. It's got a nice pace of life, I think, without being a backwater. I mean, I spent 3 years traveling to the most sparsely settled counties in the United States. And what struck me with the people I met in these places, way out in eastern Montana or up in the Rocky Mountains or out in the western Texas, is this deep sense of place that the people had. It wasn't easy living there where they had, where there'd be one school in a county the size of Connecticut. But they had the sense of place, and that's goddamn where they're going to be. And we were living in Kansas at the time, Diane and I and Emmy, and then that's where Will was born. But she's a native Vermonter, and we both missed, we missed New England. And when, I started working then with Ken, collaborating with him, then I've always loved Walpole as a reporter. And so we decided to move there. never look back.
Can I add one other story? Because it's a classic New Hampshire story for me, is that when I moved up, I was reminded of it when Dayton said, try to chop your own wood. So one of the things I had to do when I moved up in '79 was heat my house with wood, and we added a second thing, and we had a big Vermont castings thing that took 2.5 foot logs, and we got our wood, and the dreaded feeling was at 4 a.m. in February when you heard the burner kick on. You did everything you could, and I would just get up and freezing, like I'm sure water in our bedroom would get a little film of ice on it. And we were just living on nothing, just absolute poverty, and loving every minute of it. It was just euphoric. So I don't know where Amy was, but I was, it was mid-February, and I'd gone out for some errands, a couple of hours of errands or more. And it was very cold, February, and I had gotten both wood stoves, particularly the one that was in the area most close to the kitchen, and I'd filled it. I got the flame going. Then I, of course, turned it way, way down. And you're hoping that when you get back, you rake up the ashes and you can embers, and you can light it again. So I walk into the house, and the first thing I realize is the stove is out, right? So I open the door and I scrape the stuff, and there is nothing there. And I'm like, this is a problem. I've already taken off my coat. And then I glance over at the answering machine. I didn't need an answering machine because on average, there was one message every 3 months. There were 17 in the time I'd been gone. And the first one was a hang-up. The second was a hang-up. The third one was the AP in Concord, New Hampshire. And they said, would you please call us? The fifth one was the AP in Boston. And then a couple of hang-ups. And then the 7th or 8th or 9th was the Boston Globe in Boston. And then it was the AP in Boston. And finally, it was a guy who was my distributor in Los Angeles. And he said, Ken, you need to call me right away. And at that point, I realized that this was the day that the nominations came out, right? And so I was like, I called Mitchell, who just passed away, and I just confirmed that that's what it was. And I was doing this happy dance like a cartoon, like Snoopy, and I'm dancing all around. And then, of course, I realized the stove is out. So but I don't need a coat. I'm warmed by this good news. And I go and I get a gigantic armload full of long, 2 foot at least long logs. And I'm not paying any attention. And I slip on some ice. And I managed to twist and fall backwards into a snowdrift that the snow from plowing the driveway had provided for me. And I fell, logs still intact, right? My shirt has pulled up, and the small of my back is warming the snow, which is now trickling down my trousers. Still holding this. And I just cracked up, because you want to know why I love Walpole? Because I said, God, I am the only nominee who has had this experience today. I am the only person who has been humbled in this way, and I just read something from Luke the other morning that said, "Whosoever exalteth himself shall be abased. He who is humble shall be exalted." And I just thought, you know what? This nomination and 50 cents gets me a cup of coffee in Walpole, New Hampshire. And I got up and, started the stove and got on with, and it's always provided that town, you all, this county, have provided me with a kind of buffer between this sort of the stuff that can go really wrong in my business and within the people who practice what we practice. And it's just been the best sort of insulation, slipping in the snow or not.
Thank you. I have several more questions, but I'm not going to ask them, because if you guys have time, we would like to take a couple of questions from the audience as well, if anyone has any. Okay, yeah. Well, let us know. Does anyone have any questions for?
There's somebody.
So you've done a lot of movies, a lot of footage. What is the most challenging piece of research or footage you ever had to work to accomplish?
Well, there's challenges in every production, and Dayton, I think, would agree with me, is a million, if not 10 million problems. You don't see problems, though, as pejorative. You see them as things like friction that need to be overcome. And so a lot of the questions are the main ones are structural. Obviously, accuracy is a really important thing, and bending accuracy, unlike a feature film where you can make stuff up to square the circle, you can't do that here. And so you're really struggling with getting it right, and at the same time finding and shaping dramatic things, storytelling stuff that doesn't naturally occur. It's what human beings do to events. And so there's lots of big 30,000 foot problems. There's specific things. You know, if you're making a film about the Holocaust in 2007, about a film about World War II, we just blithely dumped in all the worst footage. If you're doing a film about the Holocaust, as we just did a couple of years ago, you're not privileging the perpetrators in the same way anymore, right? You got to show it. It's got to be bad and disturbing, but you don't need to have bodies dumping out of bulldozers, front loaders, and things like that. You can show that you can be more delicate. So a lot of it is, this is a home movie taken by somebody proud of the fact that he's shooting a Jew in the head in Ukraine. Or a home movie in which you've just rushed 6 guys out of a truck and shot them down, right? Another time is just, you need somebody to talk about something and nobody has. So do you write it? Do you find a first person quote to do it? So there are millions of them. And I mean, every film, we could literally spend the next 12 hours, each of us taking turns of those little decisions sometimes in which, you know, there's poetic license, which you often have to take. I made a film about the Civil War. There were, you know, we think maybe 1 million photographs taken. About 120,000 survive to this day. I've looked at least 100,000 of them, and I've shot between 16 and 20,000 of those photographs. I know them really well. Not one is of battle. And I made a film about a war in which battle is going on in about 20 or 30% of any given moment of the film, right? And so that means you have to take the pictures of the dead afterwards and put sounds of gunfire. You have to do the cut close up to the cannon of the assembled regiment beforehand or afterhand, and sort of, you know, find something. The edges of daguerreotypes are often blurred, and there in the blurring of the trees is action and dynamism that might be part of the heat of battle. So you're always trying to figure out how to tell something artfully and truthfully, and it's a wonderful razor's edge to be on in all the cases. And I don't think that I feel even, and some of the films are harder. I'm working on a history of the American Revolution right now. There's not a single photograph, unless you guys have a photograph here. There's no newsreel, unless you guys have some newsreel. So what do you do? How do you tell the story? How do you make a painting, which is not the same as a photograph of Abraham Lincoln? How do you make a painting of George Washington do the same thing as a photograph of Abraham Lincoln? It's unbelievably complicated and exhilarating to have to do that. And you'll be the final judge, but I'm sure Dayton has a gazillion stories too and a take on it. It's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, the main thing is just sort of reiterates with Ken is that each of the films that I've worked on with them have their own unique challenges, and you just witnessed why it's been so wonderful working with him, because they aren't challenges, they're opportunities, and creative opportunities. So Lewis, I'll just give you one. Lewis and Clark, you know, they were inconsiderate too to documentary filmmakers by they left 40 some years before the invention of photography, and there weren't hardly any good paintings of. There's 2 or 3 paintings of Meriwether Lewis, formal portraits, and same with William Clark, and so. We didn't have that. But as we're out on, you know, filming the landscape of it, they did, fortunately for the writer, leave their journals. And so we knew that we had their voice to be read by actors, helping us tell the story, and we had interviews. But we would never really be able to look at them into their eyes. And so what we realized is that we would become their eyes. So you would hear them, their journal of that day, while you're looking at a changing landscape. Fortunately, their traverse is across, changing landscape at changing seasons. And so we could become their eyes, but be standing next to them rather than looking at them. And all the films have those kind of challenges, which at first you think are very challenging, and then the fun part is trying to solve that and turn it into doesn't look like you're just vamping, that you're bringing people into the story.
One more.
If you do know me, you still can ask the question.
One of the techniques you use is to zoom in on a still photograph, zoom out, and pan around it. That's called the Ken Burns effect. Did you invent that?
Well, the thing that you call the Ken Burns effect, the label, I would never deign, and no one in Cheshire County would permit me to deign to call it that. It was just the way we were trying to wake up these photographs. My father was an anthropologist, but an amateur still photograph. My first memory is of being in a darkroom that he built, and watching that magical alchemy. My teachers at Hampshire College down the road were all social documentary still photographers and kind of filmmakers. And so the DNA of our work is a still photograph. And so I treat it the way of the feature filmmaker that I originally wanted to be before they rearranged my molecules to do first documentary and then history, which is a latent love of mine. It was to treat it like a master shot. Did it have a wide shot, a medium shot, a close shot, a tilt, a pan, a reveal, the details of it, to energetically not just see and explore with that eye the landscape of a two-dimensional image and try to make it three-dimensional, but also knowing and trusting that it had a past. This was an arrested moment. Something had happened. That horse had walked into the frame, click, and then had walked out. So to not only look at, but listen to the photographs and make them come alive. It's very, very complicated. It involves also oral dynamics of soundtrack and sound effect and first person as well as third person voices and all of that sort of stuff. Lots of ways to do it. And I got a call in November of 2002 from Steve Jobs when it was like, yeah, right. And they go, no, it really is Steve Jobs. And I picked it up and he said, look, I really like your stuff. Can you come out and visit me? So the next month, December, I went out and visited him and he took me into a room. We talked for a while. He liked the films and stuff like that. Took me in a room with two engineers and they had perfected, I'm pretty much, as Dayton will tell you, a Luddite. And so, I think we had maybe one computer that was broken in the office. And he said, this allows us to take in the photographs that you take, meaning from your cameras that you're uploading or downloading the photographs. I don't even know the term. And he said, and then you can pan and zoom through them. You pan and then dissolve and zoom at the same time and that. And I said, interesting. And he said, and every Mac computer next month, starting in January in 2003, will have this. And I said, great, as if it, like it meant nothing to me. And he said, and we want to keep the working title. And I said, what is it? And he goes, the Ken Burns effect. And I said, I don't do commercial endorsements. And he goes, what? And I said, I don't do commercial endorsements. And so the engineers, used to his temper, I suppose, I never saw it, just kind of were mortified. He said, well, come with me. And we went back to his office. And after about an hour of conversation, we sort of became friends. I understand what he wanted. And people have always told me, man, you should have asked for, like a tenth of a penny every time it was used. I said, Steve Jobs would then call it the pan and zoom effect. And I hadn't even thought that you would ever charge money for it or that. But I said, what if you gave me a lot of hardware and software that I could give away to nonprofits, to historical societies, to other things, children in poverty groups, to colleges, the software, the editing, Final Cut Pro, which was an Apple invention. And he said, fine. And over the course of the thing, it probably is over $1 million worth of equipment. One computer fell off the truck and ended up in the office. I feel obliged, like Michael Cohen, to admit. And anyway, I ended up with a lifelong friendship with Steve Jobs, but it's a very superficial version. And I can tell you that we have saved tons of vacations and birthdays and memorial services and bar and bat mitzvahs and things like that of people who have downloaded their photographs and made a little story using the Ken Burns effect. Steve is long gone, so I can say I used to stay with him when I went out into the Silicon Valley. That I have never used it. My children have used it, but I have never used it. Please don't tell anybody.
One more question.
Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between Walpole and your production facilities? Do you do your editing in Walpole? Do you do your work in Boston? A little bit about your production crew and where you're actually getting that work
down
done.
from where Dayton used to live on the corner of Pleasant and Elm Street, we have an editing house. We used to edit in one of my bedrooms in my house, and then it moved out to our office above the garage where still the world headquarters of Florentine Films still is. Back in analog days when we were shooting film and editing physically on film, we had upwards of 40 people in this editing house a day, a dozen interns from Dartmouth, from Keene State, from other places that would come and do the painstaking job of reassembling all this, the work print that we used with before we were finished. If we wanted to mark a fade out, we drew it in grease pencil just as an indication or a dissolve. Nothing, you couldn't see a dissolve. We wanted to identify him as Dayton Duncan, writer. We had to wait until the film was done to see that in place. We sort of knew where that came up. That house was an old doctor's house. It had Indian shutters. It was perfect to darken a room for screenings. And we're still there. COVID really changed the dynamics of everything. Also, I had developed a couple of producing teams, not just Dayton, but others who lived in New York. And so we've had since the late 90s an office in New York, which has grown in size and scope and moved a few different places. And now, because of another production team with my oldest daughter and my son-in-law, David McMahon, Sarah Burns and David McMahon, we have an office in Brooklyn. And so editing now can be done remotely. So Elm Street, I spent most of the day at what we call Elm Street, where, it's not that occupied, but it's still there. We make the films here, essentially. We're about 30 people are about to descend on my barn, where we're going to look at somewhere between the rough and a fine cut of the Revolution project I was telling you, 6 parts, 12 plus hours. And some of them are scholars. We've already had 2 big sessions with scholars, and they've been incredibly helpful. Now we're bringing in people in public television and our partners and a few warm bodies, people who don't know about filmmaking and don't know about the Revolution. We can watch them watch it and hear what they liked and what they didn't like and that sort of stuff. And they're not focus groups. That's not that. It's just sort of neighbors and friends that we bring in to just say, what'd you like or what you didn't like? Where'd you get confused? That sort of stuff. So that's still going on in Walpole. Every once in a while, I might yield to the fact that one project's a majority of its employees are in New York, as this project is, and we'll have a screening in New York. And we did that in April, but then we all moved en masse up to Walpole to do the editing corrections that are generated by the screening over, in this case, 3 days, 1 episode in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, 6 episodes. You do the math. Vietnam is 10 episodes. That's an entire day. You cannot believe how tired academics get doing that sort of work for 5 straight days without rest, even though we filmed them. No, we've worked with some amazing scholars who've made the films great. So it's all still happening essentially in Walpole, and I'm not leaving there, so it's there. Even the team in Brooklyn comes up now and then to screen and do editing passes. It's the world headquarters. We just finished a film, the Brooklyn team and I, on Leonardo da Vinci. which kind of makes Florentine films make a little bit of sense now. It's our first non-American topic. I see no other non-American topics on the horizon, but now at least we can explain what Florentine films means. It actually means Florence, Massachusetts, where one of our beloved teachers at Hampshire lived. And as a joke, when somebody said, "What's the name?" and I said her name, Elaine Mays, and he said, "What's the company?" and I just said Florentine Films, and then it stuck.
I think we could indeed stay here until 1:30, but I think instead we'll let you do some interacting one-on-one. Please join us for refreshments and reception next door. We want... Thank you all for being here, for all that you do for the Historical Society, and especially thank you to our wonderful guests and their stories. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was great.